Chapter 21. The Korean War. On Sunday, June 25, we all loaded into Lee's Chevy and headed for the Wheat Harvest Festival in Wichita Falls, Texas. While en route to their shocking news filled the airways of the radio, North Korean Communist forces had struck out across the 38th parallel, attacking the Republic of Korea, an ally of the United States. A token number of our troops were stationed there as occupation forces, and were considered to be in great peril. I mentioned to the boys that we didn't have to be concerned about a job when we got home, we would all be headed for Korea. We had fun at the festival and returned to Floydada, Texas. On the 27th, President Truman agreed to send troops to the aid of Seoul, the capital of South Korea. The following day, General Douglas MacArthur landed in the southern part of Korea as the capital fell under an onslaught of communist forces. He landed 200 miles behind the front lines to pose for some pictures, then scurried back to Japan. The following day, President Truman said the U.S. is not at war. He would continue to call it anything but a war for the next 3 years. He called it a police action and also a conflict, but never a war. A willing news media parroted him, and this would set the pattern that would continue for the next 50 years, much to the chagrin of about 5 million veterans. It would become known as the Forgotten War. Except for those who were participants or had lost loved ones there. The following day, he extended the military draft into the year of 1951. The handwriting was on the wall: our harvest crew would soon be going to war. None of us had any idea of what we would be required to face in the near future. One member of this crew would be killed in action 1 year, 1 month, and 9 days, from this day. We would never be quite the same again, but we didn't realize it during those carefree days in Texas. I was still a member of the Navy Reserve but hadn't attended a drill for some time. Upon my return home, I would have to start attending again or be drafted into the Army. After we finished cutting Stringer's wheat, we headed north to Amarillo. We spent the night there, but I don't recall where we stayed that night. We must have found rooms somewhere. I do recall the old Boar's Nest was parked alongside the street. We all had a night on the town, and the following morning we found King asleep in a pile of cotton hulls beside the trailer. He and Foster had made a night of it, and he was still in sad shape. Lee had him ride in the Boar's Nest to sober up. It was a real cooker that day, and when we came to a long hill, I would pull the hand throttle out and stand on the running board in an effort to cool off a bit as the old 37 Chevy would grind up the hill, pulling the huge combine at 15 miles per hour. However, there was no relief to be found in the blazing hot sun. In the middle of the afternoon, after crossing the Oklahoma Panhandle, we reached the port of entry at Liberal, Kansas. Lee said maybe we had better check on King. He may have suffocated in that hot trailer. When he opened the door, you could feel the pent-up heat roll out. It was like a bake oven. Old Verg wobbled out 3 sheets in the wind. He had found a case of hot beer Tat Lee had forgotten about, and had drank a good portion of it. We headed on up Highway 83 and passed through Garden City and up through the big open plains of western Kansas. Later in the day, we stopped for a break, and Lee paid King and Foster their $250 each. They immediately knelt on the hot concrete highway, and at first I thought they were fixing to have a prayer meeting. Bob pulled a set of dice from his pocket and held them in his clenched fist, blew on them, and tossed a $20 bill down and said, "I'll shoot you 20. Virgil pulled out a handful of 20s and tossed one onto the pavement, and Bob made the dice dance across the hot pavement, and the game was on. It made little difference who won, they would both spend it drinking together at the next town we hit. The casino was shut down when Lee said we're burning daylight and had better get on up the road. We made it up to Colby late in the evening and set up camp there. Eni Spencer had contacted me and said that our wheat would be ready to harvest the first part of July. So Dutch found another driver at Colby, as there were several hundred harvesters gathered there. I bought myself a bus ticket to St. Joe and headed out across Kansas on Highway 36. One evening after returning home, I attended a softball game. I saw my friend Bill Goff sitting in his brown 41 Packard, and he had a girl with him. I went over to his car and was surprised and pleased to find that his date was Maureen Hines. I climbed into the front seat with them and spent a while visiting, mostly with Maureen. It would be a few months before our paths should cross again. In early July, Eni dragged his dad's old pull-type John Deere combine up to Stanberry, and we started thrashing our wheat. We hauled it to the grain elevator in Stanberry, and it made about 12 bushel to the acre and brought $2.05 per bushel. We had to pay for half the seed, and all the other expenses of getting the crop planted and harvested. Then we gave Doc Simmons half of what the grain brought. Then Eni and I had to split our half. Then I had to pay him some for combining. I probably came out with $300 net. I had went in the hole on the Texas trip and I had to pay Dutch $40 that he had advanced me. A couple of days later while in St. Joe I saw the car of my dreams. It was sitting on a used car lot on the southeast corner of 8th and Charles Street. It was a 1936 gray Ford Coupe. After a little negotiating I bought it for $250. I thought life was beautiful and I had the world by the tail on a downhill pull. My old buddy Billy Frank and I went to work for Gerald W. Rhodes and his brother. They were two of the fastest plasters around. We were hod carriers. It was our job to mix the plaster in an electric mixer and carry it to them in 5-gallon buckets. They could really spread it on, it literally kept us running to keep up with them. It was a real tough job and one that required a lot of stamina. On July 31st, President Truman authorized a broad military buildup for the fighting in Korea and granted the military the power to wage war. This was a very controversial move. According to our Constitution, Congress was the only power that could declare war. This would set a precedent for years to come. In order to sidestep the law, Constitution, rather than calling it a war, he coined the term police action. Had he not used that terminology, it is likely he would have been forced to recall the troops until Congress voted in favor of the action. Later on he tested his executive power by trying to take over the steel mills to ensure that they didn't hinder the war effort. This time the Supreme Court came down on him and claimed that he was acting outside of his authority. He determined that the best way to fight the war was under the umbrella of the United Nations, even though the other nations sent small token forces. It was made to appear as though the entire world was up in arms in this humanitarian effort. The strategic battlefield decisions were being made back in Washington, D.C., and the United Nations in New York City. This may sound ludicrous, but the Soviet Union, who were the instigators and financiers of our enemy, sat on the UN Security Council and knew the moves that we were going to make before our field commanders did. Thank goodness the troops or the American public were not aware of this until years later, but now they are. These actions would set the stage for United States involvement in Vietnam 20 years later. President Kennedy used Truman's actions as his precedent to involve U.S. troops in that bloody struggle. My friends Bill Goff, Bill Chambers, and Jerry Arnold had finished their one-year hitches the previous year, and were ordered to report for active duty in 30 days. Bill was to report to Camp Pendleton, California, and Billy Frank Chambers, to El Toro Marine Air Base, up Highway 101 at Santa Ana. Jerry Arnold was in the Navy and was ordered to report to Astoria, Oregon. I was still in the Navy Reserves and would probably return to that or be drafted into the Army. It was highly unlikely that the Navy Reserves would be activated. In August, Jerry Arnold started dating my sister, Suzanne. I was pleased to have my good friend going with my little sis. One Saturday night during the first part of August, Bill Goff and Billy Frank and I went to town for their going-away party. We were at the Blue Town Rathskeller at 1002 South 10th Street, in Joetown. At that time this was a popular place for the young folks to hang out. During the course of the evening they had been working on me in an effort to recruit me into the Marine Corps. Finally, in a moment of weakness, I made a decision that from that day on would have a great deal of impact on me for the rest of my life. Because I was not 21, I had to get my folks' permission. Dad wasn't hard to convince. He probably figured that milital life would help me get my feet on the ground, so to speak. Mom was more difficult. It required a great deal of persuasion, but she finally relented. When I told my older brothers that I was enlisting in the Marine Corps, they said, "You must be crazy, that's the toughest outfit in the world. You could get yourself killed in there?" Of course they had both served in the Army during World War II. In the meantime I had talked Alfred Carl into joining with me. He was the older brother of my classmate Clifton Carl. Cliff would join the Navy. The night before we went down to join up, Alfred and I went down to Easton, Missouri, to have our going-away party at Crazy George's beer joint. The following morning Bill and Billy Frank drove out to our house. I bid my mom goodbye and they drove me down to the recruiting office in the post office building, at 8th and Edmund Streets in downtown St. Joseph. Alfred's dad George brought him to St. Joe and dropped him off at the recruiting office. A short time later my two recruiters, Bill and Billy Frank, bid me farewell and good luck, and took the elevator down. A few minutes later I looked out the window and down below on 8th Street, and watched them drive away in my little gray pride and joy. While we were there, a couple of other fellows were leaving for Kansas City. They were an unusual looking pair, they both had their heads shaved, and had full beards. They were both big burly guys. One was Robert L. Pete Patton Jr., and the other was Richard Dick Heelswert. They had attended Neely Grade School and Central High. Dick had went to Wesley Methodist Sunday School with me. Alfred and I were taken to Kansas City by the recruiting sergeant, where we would be processed and given our physical exams, after which we would take the oath of allegiance. This was old hat for me. I had did this the previous year, and was hoping that I would be successful this time. Alfred had fallen arches, the bottoms of his feet were as flat as an ironing board. And he was turned down like I had been this year. He was real disappointed. He had to return to Clarksdale to await the call from his draft board. Bob Foster had continued on through the harvest into South Dakota, and had just made it home when he received notice from his draft board. He was the first man to be drafted in Doniphan County, Kansas. In September, he and I both entered the military service. He was sent to Colorado for his training. As it turned out, we also left the States at about the same time. I passed with flying colors this time around, and with about 20 others raised my right hand, and swore to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, etc., and was officially a United States Marine. The date was Wednesday, September 6, 1950, a day that I would always remember. The oath was administered by Major Stanley S. Hughes, USMC, Officer in Charge, District Headquarters Recruiting Station, Kansas City, Missouri. This was a proud moment for me and one that I will always remember. For the first time in my life I felt like I was doing something meaningful and important. Now all that I needed was one of those fancy dress blue uniforms and my self-esteem would know no bounds. The fellow that had been in front of me all through the processing would become a good friend of mine and would be with me all through training. Our serial numbers were the same, except for the last digit. His name was Richard G. Smith, and was from the little town of Granby, in the southwest part of Missouri. His dad was the school superintendent there. We were housed that night in a small hotel a short distance from the processing center. We would leave the following morning on the westbound train for Los Angeles, but we had the evening free to do as we pleased. Richard had an aunt that lived in Kansas City, and she invited him out to her place for supper. He asked if it would be all right to bring his friend. She told him that he certainly could. They picked us up at the hotel and we had a great meal and a very enjoyable evening. The following morning we were taken to the Union Station. It was alive with activity. However, it was not as busy as it had been the last time I was there to pick up my brother Bob when he returned from World War II back in 1945. One of the members of our group was assigned to be in charge. He was to make sure that we all got to our destination in one piece. We were told that we were now government property and it was therefore unlawful for us to get ourselves lost or damaged. This was my first train trip, not counting the caboose rides to Clarksdale when I was a railroad gandy dancer. A lot was going through my mind as the train pulled slowly out of the station and headed west where an entirely new life awaited me. Our train had several Pullman cars, a couple of dining cars, and a club car. It was a pretty classy train and they even had cloth napkins. I learned early in life that when you were served with cloth napkins the price of the meal increased astronomically. However, these meals were on Uncle Sam and would be for as long as we were in the Corps. I also learned that sleeping in a Pullman car and listen to the click of the wheels is hard to beat for good sleeping. I started cut in the Corps with the best sleeping accommodations in the world, and as you will see, I eventually ended up with the worst. The following day I wandered up to the club car and saw a very attractive young lady sitting at a table sipping a fancy drink from a long stem glass. I, being a good time Charlie, asked her if I could buy her a drink. She gave me a coy smile and batted her dreamy eyes and said I'd be delighted. That was my cue to moved in for the kill. After spending the afternoon visiting with her, and conjuring up all sorts of fantasies that I might carry out during the remainder of the journey, I excused myself to go to the restroom. While there I took an accounting of my financial worth and in lawyer jargon, found that I was getting dangerously near to becoming insolvent. In other words, I was down to my last few bucks and would have to abandon my dreams of conquest and call off the hunt. Upon my return I excused myself and made a hasty retreat. That evening when I passed through the club car she was sitting with a young Marine lieutenant, still batting her eyes like a frog in a hailstorm and sipping from a long-stemmed glass. Being an officer of Marines, he could probably afford to keep the fancy drinks coming until the journey's end. And he might cash in on his rather substantial investment. Billy Frank and Bill Goff told me all about boot camp, so I expected the worst. The train pulled into Los Angeles on September 8. When we disembarked, there was a Marine sergeant waiting to greet us as we stepped down from the train. He wasn't a very pleasant-looking fellow, and he seemed to be a little put out of not having to be there. After all that I had heard about the Corps, I looked for him to start cussing us. He ordered us onto a Marine Corps bus that was parked outside. After riding a short distance, he told us that there was to be no more talking. In about 2.5 hours we arrived at the city limits of San Diego. Most of us, including Richard Smith and I, had forgot about the no-talking orders and were jabbering about the sights along our tour route.